Commander, welcome. Today, we're jumping right into this explainer detailing our criminological review of history's absolute most notorious unresolved files. Look, our objective here isn't just to, take a walk down memory lane. We're here to deeply analyze these historical anomalies so we can inform and really sharpen our modern investigative strategy. So, let's dive right in.
Okay, so here's our agenda for this executive briefing. We're going to cover 6 key areas. First up, the cold keys briefing itself, followed by compromised scenes and deterioration. Then, we'll analyze perpetrator communications and media sensationalism and interference. Finally, we'll wrap up with the promise of modern DNA and our specific directives for case review. Basically, we're looking at how systemic historical failures can actually give us the blueprint for modern forensic resolutions.
Starting things off with Section 1, the cold case briefing, establishing the historical scope. We really need to examine the chronological span of these anomalies, just to understand how police work has evolved, and honestly, to spot the recurring flaws over the decades.
Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, wow, that is a massive timeline. And it is. Staggering, really, spanning all the way from the poverty-stricken streets of 1888 London with Jack the Ripper, up to a quiet Tokyo suburb in the year 2000 with the Setagaya family. These files represent literally over a century of forensic limitations. But here's the wild part. Across completely different eras and continents, task forces hit the exact same brick walls, a lack of scientific tools and super inconsistent protocols.
And that brings us perfectly to our guiding methodology, historical criminology. Applying this means we're viewing these tragic events not just as, cultural myths or campfire stories, but as absolutely critical case studies in investigative protocol. When we look at these older cases through the lens of our modern standards, it's like a giant puzzle. We can point to the exact moment the chain of evidence broke down.
Moving on to Section 2, compromised scenes and deterioration, focusing on the destruction of the evidentiary chain. Let's look at how early police forces routinely, and I mean routinely, compromise crime scenes, permanently destroying the very physical evidence we rely on today.
Take a look at this stark comparison. The 1996 John Benet Ramsey investigation in Boulder, Colorado, was immediately plagued by some major foundational errors. I mean, friends and family were actually allowed to just freely move through the house before the scene was properly secured. Compare that to our modern protocol today: immediate lockdown, strict perimeter control, and super limited scene access. By failing to freeze that scene back in '96, investigators allowed an untold amount of trace evidence to be completely contaminated or destroyed within just those first few crucial hours. Or consider the 1922 Hinterkaifeck murders in Germany. This is an even more extreme example of scene deterioration. A family of 6 was brutally killed with a mattock, right? But get this, the perpetrator actually stayed on the farmstead for days afterwards. They were eating meals from the kitchen, literally tending to the livestock. That delay caused massive degradation of the physical scene before police ever showed up. And to make matters worse, whatever crucial evidence files they did manage to collect were later lost entirely during World War II. All right, Section 3, analyzing perpetrator communications, or as I like to call it, when taunting derails investigations. Next, we're going to analyze how psychological taunting often served as a massive distraction, pulling early task forces away from pursuing hard physical evidence. Just look at how these communications completely hijacked the trajectory of these investigations. From Jack the Ripper's letters in red ink taunting Scotland Yard, though admittedly their authenticity is still debated, to the Zodiac's multi-part ciphers, perpetrators forced investigators into totally reactive postures. And it happened again in the 1982 Tylenol murders. Lace capsules were causing nationwide panic, and an extortion letter sent by James W. Lewis demanding money completely derailed the focus. Even though Lewis was eventually convicted of extortion, he was never actually charged with the murders themselves. So the takeaway here is how effectively these criminals manipulated the environment. The Zodiac, for instance, specifically weaponized the press in Northern California. He demanded his encoded messages be published, signed with that infamous circle and cross symbol, while claiming responsibility for murders and threatening even more. It created an absolute circus. It consumed endless FBI and local police resources, while amateur and professional cryptographers spent decades chasing puzzles instead of physical leads. We actually see this kind of strange communication manipulation in the Ramsey case too. An unusually long 2.5-page ransom note was found demanding exactly $118,000. Now that number suspiciously matched the father's recent bonus. Plus, it was written on paper taken from inside the house and used highly unusual phrasing.
Instead of leading to the killer, this note just raised intense suspicion around the family and totally skewed those critical early hours of the investigation. Which brings us to Section 4, Media Sensationalism and Interference. Managing the narrative is absolutely crucial because the severe interference caused by public panic and media frenzies can completely tank an investigation. Think back to 1947, the brutal staging of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short deeply horrified officers. Her body was severed at the waist, drained of blood, and her face was slashed into what became known as a Glasgow smile, a severe wound extending from the corners of the mouth toward the ears. But instead of letting detectives quietly work the case, the press turned this horrific tragedy into a Hollywood spectacle, famously dubbing her the Black Dahlia after a recently released movie. And the fallout from that media frenzy? Disaster for the task force. The press blended fact and rumor so thoroughly that it generated dozens of false confessions. Los Angeles detectives were forced to waste thousands of hours questioning hundreds of suspects. Doctors, men from her social circle, you name it, basically chasing ghosts created by newspaper headlines. The case became deeply embedded into popular culture, but sadly, it never saw the inside of a courtroom. Even decades later, the exact same thing happened. In 1999, the broad daylight shooting of beloved BBC presenter Jill Dando triggered a massive inquiry that was severely complicated by sensational media theories. Because she was a high-profile target known for presenting the program Crime Watch, the media wildly speculated on everything. Was it a professional contract killing? Revenge by criminals she exposed on TV? Political motives linked to her charity work? The noise just completely overwhelmed the signal. So, Chief, reviewing all these historical missteps raises a really critical question for our current strategy. Knowing that scenes were compromised and media frenzies derailed early detectives, how can we retroactively apply modern DNA technologies to finally cut through all that noise and resolve these anomalies today? That leads us right into Section 5, the promise of modern DNA, pivoting to forensic resolution. We really have to focus our resources on cases where physical evidence was, even inadvertently, preserved and is now viable for advanced genetic testing. The 2000 Setagaya murders in Tokyo stand out as a prime example here. In this case, the perpetrator actually hung around inside the house for several hours after killing the family of 4. He used the family computer, took a nap on the sofa, and left behind just an unprecedented amount of biological material. We're talking his clothing, his fingerprints, and even a half-eaten ice cream left in the refrigerator. All of this yielded a crystal-clear DNA profile indicating male, mixed East Asian heritage. It is a literal biological goldmine, exactly the kind modern task forces need to revisit. But, we also have to recognize DNA's profound power to correct past investigative tunnel vision and actually exonerate the innocent. Let's look back at the Jill Dando case again. A local man named Barry George was convicted of her murder in 2001 based on circumstantial evidence. But that was a massive forensic failure. In 2008, a crucial correction happened. His conviction was completely overturned, and he was acquitted in a retrial because the DNA evidence used against him was ultimately deemed inconclusive. Modern science demands absolute precision. And even in heavily compromised scenes like the Ramsey house, where we already know the initial containment was an absolute disaster, modern DNA re-extraction techniques have recently provided new biological clues. We just aren't stuck with the science of 1996 anymore. Trace evidence that was previously unreadable can now be amplified and analyzed. It's a real game changer. Finally, Section 6, Directives for Case Review. Based on all the findings in this explainer, I am submitting the following actionable steps for your immediate review, Commander. We strongly recommend implementing a strict 3-step protocol. Step 1, we conduct a systematic audit of all our historical cold case evidence faults. Just go right through them. Step 2, we identify and isolate any preserved physical evidence that's suitable for DNA re-extraction. And step 3, we immediately apply modern genetic genealogy profiling to any of those viable biological samples we uncover. It's time to stop relying on century-old detective notes and let the biology do the talking. Cases like the 1970 Isdal woman found in Norway are perfect candidates for this exact protocol. Her charred body was found surrounded by burned belongings. Her clothing labels were literally cut out, and fingerprints were wiped from objects. She used multiple false identities and changed wigs traveling across Europe, sparking all sorts of Cold War espionage theories. Early police hit a total brick wall against these forensic countermeasures. But today,
modern isotopic analysis and advanced genetic reevaluation could finally trace her true origins. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We've seen exactly how early forces failed, but we also know the immense, undeniable power of today's science. Commander, which dusty box sitting quietly in our own evidence vault right this second holds the biological key, the microscopic trace of DNA, needed to finally close our oldest, most haunting case? The answers are sitting right there waiting for us. We just have to use the right tools to find them.